Will you open your Bible to Psalm 123? Psalm 123. I like to find my way to the Psalms. And Psalm 123 is a psalm of ascent. It's part of a collection that runs from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134, songs that pilgrim travelers sang as they approached the holy city on festival days. And it was these songs on their lips that would attend their sometimes difficult journey, and each one of them so instructive. Psalm 123 is, like the rest of them, quite brief, but this one is especially short, just 4 verses long, rivaled in brevity only by Psalm 131. But let's look at Psalm 123 of this collection and see what God has for us tonight. A song for troubled travelers that look to God for grace. It's titled A Song of Ascents. To you I lift up my eyes, to you whose throne is in heaven. Behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maid to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to Yahweh our God until he is gracious to us. Be gracious to us, O Lord. Be gracious to us, for we have endured much contempt. We have endured much ridicule from the proud, much contempt from the arrogant. This is the very word of the living God. A world in turmoil. A constant threat of violence and war. The chaos of political uncertainty, and a society with a detachment from the morality it had once known. It sounds familiar, but I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about the fall of 1941. The head of the religious broadcasting at the BBC, the Reverend J.W. Welch, had just read a recently published book by a professor at Oxford. He was a professor of medieval studies and English literature, and this executive at the BBC in charge of religious broadcasting on this national station had thought the book had a message that was needful at this time in Great Britain. He wrote a letter to the author asking if he'd be willing to lecture on the radio, to do some brief talks, 15 minutes long, trying to make a case for Christianity in a society that had endured the Great War and had lost its faith. A survey of Royal Air Force men was taken, and only 23% of them knew the meaning of Easter. England had become increasingly secular and enlightened and rationalistic and scientific in its pursuits, and religion had become corrupted by liberalism and by an increasing awareness that it did not have answers to the big problems that were on the world stage. It was at the same time that the Blitzkrieg was in full effect. Between September 1940 and May 1941, the German Luftwaffe poured bombs on London. Over and over again, bombs flattened whole districts of London and other cities in the English countryside. It was 9 months of continuous bombing raids. By the end of it, 44,652 people, British citizens, had been killed. I mean, this is the equivalent of 9/11 happening over and over and over again as the German Air Force pummeled Great Britain. A few years ago, I read a book about the Blitzkrieg called The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson, a powerful and evocative narrative telling of those dark nights in London. He describes it this way: the bombs fell until 6:15 a.m. The blackout ended at 7:54. The moon still shone in the clear dawn sky, but the bombers were gone. The cathedral was a ruin with melted lead still dripping from its roofs, and fragments of charred timber now and then coming loose and falling to the ground. Throughout the city, the most common sound was that of broken glass crunching under people's shoes. One news reporter observed glass so thick that looking up the street, it was as if it was covered with ice. Now came scenes of horror. A man named A.E. Cox saw a man's headless body beside a bomb crater. Elsewhere, an exploded landmine left behind a collection of charred torsos. Bodies arrived at a makeshift morgue at a rate of up to 60 per hour, and morticians had to deal with a problem they had rarely, if ever, been compelled to confront. Between 40 and 50% of the victims were classified as unidentifiable owing to mutilation. It was this horrific, life-changing scene that this head of religious broadcasting wrote to this newly converted Christian who had just started to write books about Christianity, and said that his combination of wit and wisdom and his eager defense of the faith might be exactly what England needed. The standards of morality were low. People did not altogether believe in the existence of God anymore. And what C.S. Lewis intended to do in these brief radio talks was to convince skeptical people that God sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to redeem the world. It was not exactly prime time. He was put on the radio in the evening on Wednesday nights from 7:45 to 8 o'clock. That sounds like a decent time, right? But in the program right before, it was News for Norway broadcast in Norwegian. And immediately following Dr. Lewis's address was a program of Welsh music from a festival pre-recorded. I think that's probably polka, and polka is bad. It was to this context that C.S. Lewis tried to make a case for the people to look to God in a time of unprecedented trouble, to look to God, to see themselves as sinners, and to seek grace where it could be found. It wasn't intended to be anything more than a few radio addresses and a presentation of the hope of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but those few addresses would become 25 addresses and would grow to be published into 3 different books and then eventually assembled into one book, Mere Christianity, a book that has had an outsized impact on skeptics and believers alike for many, many years beyond the life of C.S. Lewis. His goal simply was to get the people of England to turn from their sin, to recognize that there was such a thing as right and wrong, to see themselves as sinners, and to seek the grace of God in Jesus Christ, to look to God. And it's a concern that existed far before the Second World War. In this ancient song before us in Psalm 123, this song of ascents sung by travelers as they would make their way to the holy city and climb up Mount Zion, looking to celebrate and worship the faithfulness of Yahweh, they had a song that they sung. A song on their lips that was intended to likewise fix their eyes on God, to lift up their concerns above their ever-present trouble. They were a people who had endured much ridicule, verse 4. The proud and the arrogant had held them in contempt. They were filled to the brim with troubles. This journey was one that was in the context of the difficulties of life, of political turmoil, of all the disasters that God's people had faced. And of all the songs they sang, this one sounds to my ears the most desperate. Its succinctness is telling of the greatness and magnitude of the need that these people have to encounter God, to see God, to look to Him and find what they needed in their time of despair. Psalm 123 is this, according to Davidson, a brief gem of Hebrew poetry with its stair-like structure as it moves towards an encounter and an experience with God. It's a psalm, as you can tell when you glance down on it, a psalm that's consumed with just a few concerns. The first is eyes. Verse 1 has the word eyes, and then it occurs 4 times in the psalm, 3 more times in verse 2 in a structured way. Eyes, eyes of the servants, eyes of a maid, eyes look to Yahweh our God. It's a psalm, though brief, that possesses the covenant name of God 2 times, once in verse 2, once in verse 3, and it's a psalm that has a singular focus as it looks to God with a clear agenda. The singer is in need of one thing from God, one thing in their pursuit of God, one thing in their vision from God, and that thing is grace, mercy. It is the favor of God that is being sought after, and in the center of this song, it seeks that grace and will not let go of this pursuit until grace is found. And so in the context of contempt and ridicule and trouble, of disaster and pain, this is a song that looks to God with eyes of faith. James Montgomery Boyce calls it a psalm for the eyes. And that's exactly what it gives to us tonight. It provides for us language that helps us in our troubles to look to the unseen God and find grace, find help, find mercy when we need it the most. This is a song that looks to the Lord. It looks to the Lord and helps us see ourselves as His servants and as His servants, recipients of what He gives to us, which is grace. So let's look at this in 3 portions. A brief psalm, a simple psalm, but tremendous help for us. First off, look at verse 1 as we see Him with eyes of faith. Verse 1, we see Him with eyes of faith. With the identical language of Psalm 121, as the psalmist lifts up his eyes to see where his help comes from, this song of ascents likewise employs that same language of lifting up the eyes. And the eyes become a metaphor of the direction of the human heart. To you, it says, with a direct address to God, I lift up my eyes. It's directly focused on God personally, and it is possessive and personal in its quest. To you, O God, I lift up my eyes to you whose throne is in heaven. To see Him with eyes of faith is the petitioner's desire. And it knows that God is somewhere unseen, and it locates the place of God being His heavenly throne, a way that the Psalms continually refer to God as one who is sovereign, as one who is on his throne. His kingly reign is what's the direct object of this look of faith. His throne is in heaven. He's enthroned in heaven. Similarly, this language, the Psalms are full of this enthronement language. Psalm 55:19 says, God will hear and answer them, even the one who sits enthroned from of old. Or Psalm 80, verse 1, give ear, shepherd of Israel, who leads Joseph like a flock. You who are enthroned above the cherubim, shine forth. I mean, the Psalms just keep reaching out to God and seeing God as the one who is on his throne, directing all the affairs of mankind, completely sovereign, kingly, regal, noble. Psalm 99, verse 1, the Lord reigns. Let the people tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim. Let the earth shake. It's this heavenly kingship that directs the psalmist's eyes to get off of all the distractions and all the circumstances and the difficulties that would have attended a journey to the holy city as families traveled together and with other pilgrims to accomplish their mission of obedience to God and participation in his prescribed rituals, as they would encounter the threats and dangers along the way and the difficulties that each period of their history held before them, the difficulties of exile, the difficulties of enemies, all of it before them, plus the personal circumstances that attend anyone's journey in a fallen world. The danger was that their vision of God and the purpose of their climbing Mount Zion and going to Jerusalem could be blurred. You don't sing, to you I lift up my eyes, to you whose throne is in heaven, unless there is a tendency for our eyes to go down, to look the wrong direction, to be distracted, to be short-sighted, to have vision that is no longer Godward but blurred. And we all understand what that's like, both in a physical sense and in a spiritual sense. I wear these, they're called cheaters or anteojos or glasses. Or I wear them because I think two monocles would look weird. And they help me see things that are far away. And I've never been able to wear contacts. I've never tried, I never will try, because I don't think God intended us to touch our eye. Just how I feel about it. It's a personal decision. It's my Christian liberty. I don't want Visine either. I dodge when somebody comes at my eye. I read a news article on CNN. And normally I don't trust CNN, fake news, but I verified this one. The article says a 67-year-old woman scheduled for routine cataract surgery in November thought it was just dry eye and an old age causing her discomfort, she told her surgeons. But what doctors at Solihull Hospital in the UK found to be the real cause of her discomfort was much more concerning. 27 contact lenses stuck in the woman's right eye in a blue mass. A specialist trainee in ophthalmology and author of the paper said the woman hadn't complained about any visual trouble before the operation. As they used the tool, the speculum, to open her eye, he noticed a blue mass under the top eyelid. The mass was a clump of 17 contact lenses. The other 10 were discovered in an additional examination. We were all shocked, the doctor said. We've never come across this. She'd been wearing monthly disposable contact lenses for 35 years, and it was unclear how long they had been gathering in her eye. The eye is seen in the Bible as a common metaphor for spiritual sight. And like that woman, we too can accumulate distractions in a spiritual sense. If sight is that most common metaphor for trusting God, 2 Corinthians 5, 6 through 7, always be of good courage. Though we're home in the body, we're away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. There's this constant contrast in the scriptures that we do not operate on the basis of physical sight, but by faith. But faith in the scriptures is equated with seeing and beholding what is unseen. It's a paradoxical kind of approach, but we're so used to this language because it's so thoroughly biblical. Hebrews 11:1, by faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. There's something about faith that is illuminating to our spiritual eyes. And so the Apostle Paul in Ephesians prays that the eyes of their hearts would be opened. Psalm 26:3 said, "Your steadfast love is before my eyes." Well, that's speaking of our spiritual perception. In Hebrews 11, that by faith chapter, it's a reminder in verse 10 that Abraham was looking for a city that was before him, out of his field of vision, not an earthly city, but a heavenly city. And he was, what? Looking for it. And so it wasn't his physical eyes that were observing the heavenly city that he longed for this inheritance. It was his spiritual eyes. It was his spiritual perception. And that's what Psalm 123 is trying to impress on us as worshipers, that we need a clarified vision of God. We need to see God with our eyes of faith. We need to have a Godward sight, a Godward view, a Godward direction. In our earthly pilgrimage, it's always our goal, not just to get to heaven and cross Jordan's distant shore, but it's our goal to get to God. And that's what this psalm is consumed with. It's consumed with a vision of God. I lift up my eyes to you whose throne is in heaven. The worshiper wants to get to God in direct address with eyes of faith, looking not to things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen, because the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. That's what we want in our pursuit of God. It was Spurgeon who said this so well. He says everything so well. But as he commented on this verse, he said, "We must use our eyes with resolution, for they will not go upward to the Lord of themselves, but they incline to look downward or inward or anywhere but to the Lord." Isn't that true? Our physical vision can so often cloud our spiritual vision. We see our circumstances and our problems and our bills and our troubles and our family issues and the things at work and 10,000 other things that are very observable. And the thing we don't see is the unseen. That's why he says, use our eyes with resolution, for they will not go upward to the Lord of themselves, but they incline to look downward or inward or anywhere but to the Lord. He goes on to say, true saints, like obedient servants, look to the Lord their God reverentially. They have a holy awe and inward fear of the great and glorious one. They watch obediently, doing his commands, guided by his eye. Their constant gaze is fixed attentively on all that comes from the Most High. They give earnest heed and fear, lest they should let anything slip through the inadvertence or drowsiness. They look continuously, for there is never a time when they are off duty. At all times they delight to serve in all things. Upon the Lord they fix their eyes expectantly, looking for supply, succor, and safety from his hands, waiting that he might have mercy upon them. To him they look singly. They have no other confidence, and they learn to look submissively, waiting patiently for the Lord, seeking both in activity and suffering to glorify his his name. When they are smitten with the rod, they turn their eyes imploringly to the hand which chastens, hoping that mercy will soon abate the rigor of the affliction. Did you hear those words that Spurgeon used? That our wayward eyes need to look to the Lord. How? Reverentially, obediently, attentively, continuously, expectantly, singly, submissively, imploringly. How's that going for you? Is the vision of your faith submissively and reverentially and imploringly and continuously Godward? Is the gaze of your heart towards God's throne in heaven, knowing that is the only place where we can find relief from our troubles? This should spur us to read our Bibles, to see the glory of God in Christ. And this should encourage us to enter into time of prayer so that we would commune with this God that we claim to want to see and experience and adore and worship and implore. We lift our eyes up to you whose throne is in heaven. Well, that's the eyes of faith on display. And we look, like Spurgeon says, and like the psalmist says, we look to God so that we might get to God. Well, secondly, in verse 2, we not only look to God with eyes to faith, see him with eyes of faith, but secondly, we serve him in humble dependence. We serve him in humble dependence. And this is where this song becomes increasingly rich and ministers to us in a powerful way because it helps us see ourselves as we really are. If the first verse is trying to show us God as he really is, now it lets us look to ourselves to see how we identify this quest of finding God. And what the psalmist does is shows himself to be a servant of God who serves God in humble dependence. The eye metaphor continues, verse 2. Behold, it's a evocative kind of as the eyes of servants, of slaves, look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maidservant, to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to Yahweh our God until he is gracious to us. What a beautiful, beautiful verse. A threefold use of the word eyes with two examples given, both of slaves, one male servants, one a female servant, both attending to their master. Both looking specifically and directly and gazingly at the hand of the one who has authority. This eye metaphor now is an upward look that takes our gaze both still to God and to ourselves to ask, what way, what posture, what position are you looking from? So it's asking the question by way of comparison, right? As this eye metaphor unfolds, it says there are servants that look to the hand of their master and the eyes of a maidservant that look to the hand of their mistress. So, or likewise, our eyes look to Yahweh our God. That is the comparison. And it's a comparison of servants who are looking carefully at their master or at their mistress. They are trained servants. I picture this being in a royal court because this is a throne in heaven. And so to keep that same nobility in mind, these are apparently household servants. The proximity they have to their master shows that they're able to look directly to his hand. And these trained servants are watchful. They're eager to do the bidding of the master. They're anticipating every need of the mistress. You're picturing servants in a grand house or in a palace to a noble king or a powerful queen. Their attendance is ever at the ready, and the comparison unfolds as they look to the hand of the master. The hand is symbolic in the Psalms. It's often Psalm 140, that the hand of our enemies is that thing that can hurt us and that we're asking God to protect us from. When it's the hand of the Lord or the hand of our master, it's the symbol of strength and provision and protection. And so here you have this eager servant waiting on their master in great attention, fixed and focused on the hand of the master, longing for protection and provision, wanting to serve because that's what servants are for, and they are serving in this particular way. And their posture is one of humility and readiness and dependence. And it's an argument from the lesser to the greater, right? Human servants with human masters, but it's being compared to the way that all of God's servants, all of God's people in Israel was called servants of God, every one of them, not just the priests. In the new covenant, we're all called servants of God, not just ministers or church leadership, but everyone is supposed to be serving God. And the argument is from the lesser, human servants, human master, to the greater, all of God's people looking to Yahweh to receive his grace, awaiting his grace. And this metaphor, it has built into it an automatic contrast as well as a comparison. Because there's a huge difference between serving a person and serving God. There's a massive chasm between serving a man, a human being, or serving this maiden and serving God, because serving God is automatically and intrinsically radically different than serving a man. And this is so important. If we're all servants of God, if we're all to be serving the Lord Jesus Christ in his field, if we're to be ready and faithful in our service to God and our service to others, this verse teaches us something so important that shows us that it's fundamentally different when we serve God and when we serve man in one way at least. I'll give you an example. Stephen J. Lawson. It's the first one I thought of. And Isaias Munoz, our high school pastor and a wingman in the Doctor of Ministry program. Isaias, let's say that he was assigned to serve Dr. Lawson for a few weeks while he's in town. Let's just pretend. Perhaps he would get Dr. Lawson a latte. Perhaps. And he'd want to know what temperature latte that is. Is it iced or is it hot? Perhaps Dr. Lawson gets hungry. He's a mortal man. And perhaps Isaias would offer him a chicken sandwich from the Lord's chicken supply at the Chick-fil-A. And he'd ask Dr. Lawson questions that anticipate his needs. That's how service works, right? You'd say, do you like pickles on your chicken sandwich? I mean, that's just service. Perhaps he could make Dr. Lawson a few copies. And he'd ask him, can I staple these copies for you? I mean, that's what service is. Can I carry your notebook to class? I mean, I'm making all this stuff up. Dr. Lawson doesn't need this kind of service. But Isaias would want to host him well, to remove obstacles from his effectiveness, to bear his burdens and meet his needs. He would want to help and anticipate and cater to preferences. This is basic in the hospitality industry, right? When you check into a nice hotel, they don't say, it's up there. They say, can I take your bag? How was your journey? Can I get you something to drink? I mean, this is the nature of how humans serve other humans. They meet their needs. They bear their burdens. Serving God in this regard is totally different. It's the same word, serving, servants, but it's a totally different concept. Yes, we serve God. Psalm 100, verse 2, serve the Lord with gladness. And so there's a posture of joy and service, and that's the same. But there's something different about serving God, because Acts 17:25 says that God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, but gives to everyone, to all men, life and breath and everything. God doesn't need a sandwich because he's perfect in and of himself. God isn't lacking in anything. And so when we serve God, we don't serve him the way we serve a human who needs stuff. We can't remove obstacles that hinder God's effectiveness. We can't bear God's burdens, and we can't meet God's needs, because God, enthroned in immaculate perfection, has no needs. We can't help God. We can't anticipate God's lacks. Instead, we serve the Lord with gladness, and this eager expectation of all of God's servants is that we serve God in humble dependence, knowing that in serving him, we don't meet his needs, he meets our needs. Right? We serve God, and we're the ones who are the beneficiaries of his generosity. We're the ones who are helped. We're the ones who are assisted. We're the ones who are ministered to. Serving the Lord is totally different. And as we serve him with gladness, he meets our needs. And this is everything. And it's everything to this psalm. The servants look to the hand of their master for protection and provision. Because he's the one who gives to us life and breath and everything. And what is it that we seek more than anything else? What is it that we're waiting for? Why are we watching God's hand so closely and carefully and meticulously? Well, I love the last words of verse 2, until he is gracious to us. We are simply waiting for God's grace. That's the ultimate difference in our service to one another, or our service to human masters, and our service to God. It's a paradigm that's thoroughly biblical. And at the heart of this psalm is a request for grace from the posture of a humble servant whose eyes are not looking down to God, but looking up to God because of how lofty and high he is, and who are quick to watch the hand of the master, because we know ultimately that though we serve the Lord with gladness, we depend on him and look for his grace being poured out to us, because our God is perfect in and of himself, and he has no lack or want or need. This radically redefines our service, because this kind of servant could never puff out their chest and say, I'm a servant of the Most High God. Instead, it makes us low and aware that we are pleading with God for grace. He has all that we need. And so this moves very smoothly to verses 3 and 4. We see him with eyes of faith. We serve him in humble dependence. And finally, we seek his grace. We seek his grace. This plea for grace, this waiting for grace at the end of verse 2, pours out into a triple request for the grace of God found in Yahweh, looking to Yahweh until he's gracious to us. Verse 3, be gracious to us, O Yahweh, be gracious to us. And then this song ends by speaking of the context and the troubles that God's people are facing. The reason they need grace and they need God is because they've endured much contempt. The word endured means to be greatly filled up. You could translate it, we have had more than enough of contempt. We've endured, verse 4, much ridicule from the proud, much contempt from the arrogant. The proud and the arrogant in the Psalms are the voice of the unbelievers, the voice of the enemies of God's people. It is those who look down upon in an insolent kind of a way, in a condescending way, in a scoffing and mocking way. And this word in this psalm, a unique word in the Psalter, this word contempt, is the highest possible level of derision and scorn that we could even imagine. To hold someone in contempt is to see them as lower and worse and wicked and against the favor of God. And this is God's people who have been filled up with this kind of treatment. It's God's people who are well aware of the sorrows and the troubles that they've faced, of the mocking blows that they've had to handle and deal with. This is a powerful reminder of Jesus' words, in this world will have many troubles. And so they seek after God's grace. The agenda here is unhidden. Ridicule, contempt, filled, endured with this stuff. Kidner says it this way. This illuminates this psalm. This word contempt is singled out because many other things can bruise, but contempt is cold steel. It goes deeper into the spirit than any other form of rejection. This is dark. This is difficult. This is a kind of low place, a low down sort of place where we cannot find the assistance we need. And so what do? They plead for grace. The word there is mercy or grace. It's a common Hebrew word that speaks of the relief of misery. Mercy is presupposing something, isn't it? If we're asking for mercy, we're asking because we don't deserve. A plea for grace is a presupposition that we have sinned. A plea for grace is to ask for what is undeserved. To wrap our minds around what's being presented here is humbling automatically to us. It pushes us to the position of a beggar, the position of one who needs the grace of God and has a heightened awareness of that need for God's grace. It's this kind of lowly dependence and humble longing that in all our troubles, there is one thing that we long for, one thing that we are well aware that we need. And if we can't get this, we don't have anything that we need, because what we need more than anything else is the grace of God, the mercy of God. It is the only source of relief for our misery. And so this plea for grace is for undeserved favor. And then the request breaks off, apparently unanswered, leaving us looking and longing and praying for God's grace. What a psalm. A tiny little song sung by pilgrims with troubles that taught them how to serve God and how to look to God and how to beseech God for grace. It really is a psalm for servants, isn't it? It's a psalm that reminds us that Jesus led the way in this regard. Mark 10:45, when he said he didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. The paradox of Christian service is on full display in the life and ministry of our Lord Jesus Christ, because his apostles would tell us, 1 Thessalonians 1:9, that we've turned from false gods and from idols to serve the living and the true God. The examples of Christian service being fueled by dependence on God, a Godward gaze, and a humble, servant-like attitude as we plea for grace, fill the pages of redemptive history. It's a heart of service that has motivated God's people in their darkest troubles to differentiate between what it means to serve a man and what it means to serve God. There's an unusually powerful example tucked away in 2 Chronicles, verse 12, that captures the whole message of Psalm 123. It's Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, the leader of the southern kingdom, the one who led the people of God after the revolt of 10 tribes. And verse 1 tells us, 2 Chronicles 12:1, it took place when the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, that he and all Israel with him forsook the law of Yahweh. There's the sin. Rehoboam was the king and he was supposed to serve Yahweh, but he forsook Yahweh's law. Verse 3 tells us that God decides to bring judgment to King Rehoboam. He sends, because of the unfaithfulness to Yahweh, verse 2, that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem with 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen. And the people who came with him from Egypt were without number. This massive invading force is confronting Rehoboam because he has decided to serve other gods. And so God, in his grace, in his mercy, sends a prophet, a man of God. Verse 5, then Shemaiah, the prophet, came to Rehoboam. And the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of this Egyptian warlord. And the prophet says, thus says Yahweh, your God, you have forsaken me, so I have also forsaken you to Shishak. So the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, Yahweh is righteous. This is an incredible little story in the middle of 2 Chronicles. And I think it has something to teach us about Psalm 123. I think it has something to show us about how dangerous it is if we refuse to serve God with a Godward vision and a humble posture and a plea for grace. And that's what Rehoboam did. And when the prophet came and confronted him, and when the reality of God's judgment was before the leadership, they said, Yahweh is righteous. God is right, we are wrong. And look at how God moves, verse 7. And when Yahweh saw that they humbled themselves, the word of Yahweh came to Shemaiah, the prophet, saying, they have humbled themselves, so I will not destroy them, but I will grant them some measure of deliverance. And my wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem by means of Shishak, the invading Egyptian king. And here's the good stuff, verse 8. But they will become his slaves, so that they may learn the difference between my service and the service of the kingdoms of the countries. What a difficult lesson to learn. What a tough pill to swallow. For Rehoboam and the leadership of Israel, they had to learn what they were giving up by forsaking Yahweh's law, by making this exchange that we're not going to serve the one true living God, the covenant God of Israel, but we're going to serve these false gods. And God is now going to instruct them to show them that there is a big difference between being a slave of the king of Egypt and being in service to the King of the universe. A contrast we all must learn in our troubles, because troubles can obscure our vision of God and distract us from who we are and what we're called to do. And Psalm 123 is pressing on us that in our troubles, in times of turmoil, of disaster, of despair, we have one job, and it's to look to God. We look to him as humble servants look to the hand of their master. That's how we look to God. And we look to God not because we have so much to give to God. We can help God. We look to God because he has exactly what we need. Grace for sinners like us. And so we serve the true and the living God with gladness and humility. In the words of 1 Peter 4:11, we serve him in the strength that he supplies, and he gets all the glory, and we get the grace. Father, thank you for your word and how it provokes our hearts to further service to King Jesus. In times of trouble, help us to walk the long journey of obedience as servants of the Most High God, dependent on your grace. Help us to apprehend and behold the Lord Jesus Christ, God of very God, to see him as our only hope of salvation and rescue, to know that his death on the cross was in our place, that he defeated death and sin and the fear that held us captive all our lives, to free us from slavery to sin, that we might be slaves of God. And you are so good to your servants. So give us, God, the grace that we need, that we might always be looking to you. My friend, if you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, I'd encourage you to turn from your sin that enslaves you and to find in God a good and benevolent master. There's a prayer room to my right, to your left, and someone will be there after service and would love to meet with you, to talk to you about your soul, to ask you what it would take, what would be involved in you giving your life to Christ. I'd encourage you to do that tonight if you're not yet a Christian. And so, Father, be with us as we go, and help us to follow Jesus faithfully as his devoted servants and to cling to his grace. In Jesus' matchless name, amen.